Good afternoon and welcome to today's EuroSTAR webinar, Unburdening Testing, Finding the Balance Point for Test Documentation with Fiona Charles. Before we begin, I would like to bring a few things to your attention. This webinar will be recorded. You will receive email notification once it is available. The webinar will last for approximately 30 minutes and Fiona will take questions at the end of the presentation. In the event that any questions don't get answered, there will be a follow-up blog post on the EuroSTAR website with the questions and answers from Fiona. I'll now pass over to Fiona to begin the presentation.
Good morning, everyone. Well, I want to say good morning because it's morning here in Toronto. I think in Europe it's 2 o'clock. In most countries, perhaps 3 o'clock in others. And of course, in Western Canada, where I know I have 1 or 2 listeners, it's very early. So I guess I should just say good day. Let me explain a little bit before I start what I mean about finding a balance point. For me, now I need to understand how to advance this. Okay, I think I got it. How do I advance the slides, Paul? I'm clicking on next and nothing's happening. There we go. Okay, it's just slow. Sorry about that. For me, a balance point in test documentation means that we're doing as much documentation as we need to do. And you'll see I'm replacing the term documentation as I go through the webinar really with the term artifacts. But we're creating test artifacts that we need to have in order to help us do good testing. But we're not doing more than that unless there are very important overriding considerations for the project or for the company. And I'll talk a little bit about what some of those might be when I get there. But we're also not doing too little documentation. We're not trying to get by with not documenting anything, because there are often occasions when we really need to have a record of what we're doing, or simply create thinking tools for ourselves, or communicate with other people on a project. So when I talk about a balance point, that's what I mean, is finding where we are on that spectrum and what is right for us. So I'm going to start by full disclosure here and tell you what my biases are, because I think it's important to understand where I'm coming from when I talk about this. I'm a consultant, and that means that I go into a lot of organizations and work with them, sometimes to help them complete a project, sometimes assessing their test capability and helping them to improve their test capability. And what I find is that in many, many organizations, it's still the case that testing has seriously become overburdened with prose documentation. People are expected to write lots and lots of big documents that, frankly, hardly anybody, if anyone at all, reads, that to meet a standard that is really not helpful to producing good testing. So another bias that I haven't put here is that I don't think it's a good use of a skilled tester's time, or even a not very skilled tester's time, to copy and paste from one document to another. And I see people doing this between projects. So often somebody will start the test strategy for a project by copying in a bunch of things, generic risks and so on, from the test strategy for another project. But then a lot of text gets copied among project documents as well. Now, obviously that's not true on Agile projects where, in fact, there may be pressure not to do enough documentation. So, again, we need to find that balance point. Another important bias of mine is that I believe that testing is a process of discovery. I don't believe that we have done testing a service by trying to make it, trying to pretend that it is, a repeatable engineering process. When we're testing, we're exploring. Whether or not we have designed test cases to do our testing, whether or not we have artifacts that we're using to do that testing, we're still exploring. We're still finding out things about the software that we didn't know before and that perhaps nobody knew. Usually that nobody knew, in fact, because that's our job. So to me, it's much more analogous to something like a physical geographical exploration than it is a repeatable engineering process. And for that reason, I think it's a big danger if we try to constrain ourselves too much, we try to constrain our testing too much with documents and plans that we then expect we're going to stick to. Okay. Okay, now I press the next button. Maybe it's just slow. Huh. I guess it is slow. In a moment, oh, here we go. Okay, so this is just a photograph about the model or the real thing, which you can have a look at later. I guess I pressed the button too often. Okay, so I'm just going to go back to another important principle that I operate from, and that is that I don't believe in best practices. I know that best practices are something that have been promoted very heavily in our industry and that a lot of people believe in, but to me it simply makes absolutely no sense to believe that there is one practice that is going to be the very best thing on every project in every context. My experience has told me over and over again that that is simply not true. And it's particularly true, I think, when we come to talk about artifacts that we create to document what we're doing. In that case, context is absolutely paramount, as it is in just about everything else. You can have an ideal artifact set and you think, oh, that's terrific, and now I'm going to use these as templates for another project, and then they turn out to be just not right. Another very important principle to me is to say we have to get back to first principles here. Why are we documenting? We're documenting in any given context in order to facilitate good testing by skilled practitioners. And I use the term skilled practitioners advisedly because I know that in many organizations, particularly organizations where people are expected to do very detailed scripting, there's often a management expectation that you are scripting so that to the level that you can hand over those scripts to people off the street so they can execute them. It's been my experience, and it's certainly always been my strong belief that people off the street are not testers, and they're not going to make them testers by giving them detailed scripts. One or two of them may turn out, in fact, to be skilled natural testers, but it's unusual, and that's not a good way to test, and I hope we're getting away from that. Okay. This is where I think we start. Our principal product, it's not our only product, but our principal product, and quite often our only product, is to produce, to discover, and to deliver information about the software that we are testing so that our stakeholders can make informed decisions. So, I do understand that in some circumstances there are overriding considerations where you may not be able to choose exactly what artifacts you use. I've certainly been in situations where we had contractual deliverables. So we were bound by a contract to produce certain deliverables. Been in other circumstances where in organizations that are very strongly standards-based, where they insisted that we use the IEEE, whatever it is, standard for testing and templates that come out of that. I've also been in situations where we may or may not have had those things, but we had very strong management beliefs that professional testing, that we were not doing a good job of professional testing unless we had boatloads of documentation. I've worked with people who didn't think it was a good test strategy unless it was at least 50 pages and landed with a thud on their desks. They didn't read it, but that was what they believed. So I do know that there are sometimes important considerations that we can't get around. But in those circumstances, I encourage you to look for ways to maneuver. There are always things you can do in any set of constraints, or almost always. So ask the question, is it possible that instead of doing a large prose document for this particular deliverable, could I do something else? Would a diagram work instead? Obviously, you're going to do that based on your analysis of what would serve the work and what's going to make it better for you to do good testing. If you can't replace a document with something else, then what can you do to work within the constraints and do the most productive testing possible, and not spend too much time copying and pasting and writing stuff that really doesn't need to be written and that nobody's going to read. So you may be able to do a short form. There may be other things that you can do, and I strongly encourage you to do that. Project artifacts are there for a reason, and they're there to communicate. So it's very important to ask the question, what are the communications that you really need to have in order to deliver your product in the most effective and efficient way to your stakeholders? I should add, before I go on, that this webinar is primarily a set of questions. So I don't have the answers for you. As I said earlier, this really is about working within your given context. But what I hope to do is to give you a set of criteria that I find useful for making a determination about what it is we need to have. So I think it's important to ask the question, do we in fact need an artifact? For this particular communication, do I need a lasting artifact? Do I need something that's going to persist and go on the record? Is there something I could do instead? Could I do something ephemeral, for example? More than 10 years ago, I used a whiteboard very effectively for a test plan on a big systems integration test for a retail organization. There were people who were uncomfortable with that, mostly vendors from one of the big 6 consulting firms. But it was very effective. It allowed us to respond daily to what we needed to do, and in fact we were testing a very buggy set of systems, and so it allowed us to make changes to our plan and carry on. It also was a great communication tool. The whiteboard was on wheels, sat outside my cubicle. Everybody came by to have a look at it. The customer's management loved it because it was up there, visible, easy for them to see, and easy for them to see the changes and have me walk them through what we were doing at any time. So, and I know lots of teams do things like this, particularly on Agile projects, but perhaps more and more on traditional projects as well. Sticky notes, another great way to do things, perhaps sticky notes on a whiteboard, in fact. And then there's that good old-fashioned way of communicating, actually talking to people. That might be a presentation, it might be a conversation. So, worth asking, do I really need to create a record that's going to persist? If I do, then what form is it going to take? Typically, we have in the past said, oh, well, it's a prose document, and here's the template. But it may not have to be that. If it's going to be a prose document, and that may be more appropriate for some kinds of communications, then does it have to be formal? And by formal here, I mean, does it have to be something that gets signed off, that gets put in the vault for the formal record? That's separate from standardized, because a formal document does not necessarily have to be a document that comes out of a template. But does it, so then it's worth asking the question, does it have to be standardized? If it has to be standardized, if it has to be formal, does it have to be the long form? Can it be a shorter form? Can it be an informal document? And there are all kinds of ways to do that. It could be a one-pager, it could be bullet points, it could be a PowerPoint presentation. If you're using a wiki on your projects, and that's a great way to communicate, it could be a wiki note. Or how about some alternatives? I've used spreadsheets in all kinds of circumstances. I've used text tables in other circumstances. When I was guiding my own testing, I would sometimes create a state table to guide the testing. I've used visual artifacts all the time. Mind maps, beginning to use more and more, but I also have always used diagrams really heavily. And I've used them for test strategies. I've done state diagrams, again, state transition diagrams instead of state tables. So I've done formal diagrams. But I've also sometimes taken existing diagrams and either annotated them or highlighted them and used those as ways to communicate with the project. One very successful communication was on a big systems integration test, where when I went in, there were absolutely no diagrams. There was nothing that showed how systems pass data between themselves, between each other. And so one of my first jobs, in fact, I decided, because I needed to understand how the systems fit together, was to do a diagram, sort of quasi-architectural flow diagram of the entire integration. And I met with all of the teams, and I talked to them about what the inputs and outputs were for their systems, and how the data was transformed by their systems. And then I put together one big diagram for the entire set of integrated systems, and I got everyone to agree. And in fact, everyone started using it. 8 years later, I went back to the same client, and it turned out they were still using it as their architecture diagram for their integration. They had luckily kept it up to date. But having that diagram, I then sat down with my team, and we worked out what our test strategy was going to be. It was primarily a question of what the data flows were. And I highlighted it in different colors, highlighted different data flows in different colors, and then I walked it around. I took it around to each of the teams, I took it around to the managers, took it around to everyone, and said, does this make sense? And they loved it, because it was very clear what we were going to do. I stuck it on the wall, people would come in and have a look at it, we'd sit down, it was often the basis for a really good conversation. So, in fact, on that project, I did end up, because this was a long time ago, I did end up writing a formal, standardized test strategy document, although it was according to my own template, not one from a standards organization. But I did it after the project was over, and I did it for the formal record because they wanted something for the record. But during the project, the diagram was everything. Okay. Just wait for this to catch up again. There we go. So here's an example. This is from a different project. Actually, I think for the same client. This was for a point-of-sale test. It was one of 3 diagrams that I did for the test strategy. But it was how I communicated the test strategy to as the basis for how we were putting together the materials that we needed to do the test. It was a controlled data test, so it was really important that we have a model that we were working with. And really what this diagram does is it takes people through what we're doing with the data, because it was a quasi-systems integration test. So if you look down at the bottom box on the left-hand side, oh, sorry, actually no, start in the top box on the left-hand side, one-time setup. We're setting up users, we're setting up stores, we're doing an initial load of products that we're going to sell. Then down below that, once per cycle, and you'll see over on the right that we're going to do 3 or 4 day cycles. Once per cycle, we're going to do periodic changes to semi-static data. To change prices and introduce promotions and sales and perhaps cascading promotions. It all got very complex. Daily, we're going to run 2 stores. And first of all, in the store, 2 stores in different regions of Canada and therefore different time zones. And it was important also because in Canada we have a provincial sales tax as well as, at least in some provinces, provincial sales tax as well as a federal sales tax. So, so we had 2 different provinces, which complicated it considerably. So we would open the store, and then we do our daily thing of sales and returns and rain checks and all of the transactions that register and do some verification, and then back to the back office, close the store, do some verification that needed to be done on the store back office system, and then once per cycle there'd be verification done back at central office. So it's a very easy diagram to explain, very easy to take management through, and much easier than a prose document would have been to explain and for people to understand. So another example coming up, which is a mind map test strategy. And some of you will recognize this. I did this for the EuroSTAR virtual conference last fall and last autumn is, I think, the vocabulary for some of you. And it was the mind map that I did for an imaginary test strategy for a picnic basket. So again, strongly visual, easy to explain, easy to walk people through. Okay, so when we are looking for artifacts that we need, clearly we're going to be looking for artifacts that serve the work. And I think that there are 4 categories, really 4 sets of criteria that we need to look at when we're evaluating what is it we're going to do and how are we going to do it. Excuse me. First, I think we want to capture our thoughts. We don't always need to do that, but in some circumstances it's important. More importantly, for me, is to have thinking tools. Tools that, artifacts that act as tools to help me think, help me collaborate with a team on thinking, help people work together to generate thoughts. We also want artifacts that are going to guide. They may guide me. I may create something to guide myself as I go through a project, or we may, as a team, create artifacts to guide other people or for people to guide themselves. We want to inform, and there are a number of people on a project that we want to inform in different ways. And then finally, and this is not true for all projects, but in some circumstances, it may be necessary to demonstrate due diligence. And I'll go into that in a little more detail when we get there. Okay, well, in terms of thinking, I said that what's really important for me is to have thinking tools. I want tools that are going to help me get a big picture, like the systems integration diagram that I did for that retail project. I want tools that will help me clarify my thinking, but also clarify a situation. I want something that will help me develop ideas, whether I'm working by myself or working with a team. I want to understand, and I want to understand relationships. I want to understand how systems fit together, how the features of a given system fit together, how ideas fit together, how, for example, I'm going to relate risks and particular strategies to the values that drive a particular project. So how a stakeholder's needs and the stakeholder's values translate into strategies for our testing. I also want to explore details, of course, and particularly importantly, I want to be able to see my thoughts, other people's thoughts, so that we can see what the gaps are. Of course, there are potentially lots of other things, but those are, I think, a pretty representative sample of why we might want thinking tools. We're also human and we forget things. We may forget. Typically, we're not going to forget the direction we're going in, but we can certainly forget details. We will also potentially need to record decisions and the rationale for those decisions. Now, when I talk about decisions, those might be project decisions, but often they're decisions that are quite closely related to our testing, such as the scope and the rationale for those scope decisions. And those are things we might have to revisit later. So it's important to capture and to remind everyone why we made those decisions. And in fact, to have something that allows us to go back and question them if we need to. Okay, I'll just wait for this to catch up. Now, I said the second consideration was guiding. It's a somewhat ambiguous guide here, but going back to what I said earlier, I'm interested in having artifacts that guide people, not interested in having artifacts usually that direct people. So I'm not seeking to control testing with artifacts. Pardon me, I do seem to have a frog in my throat. I'm just going to clear it. So it's important when you're determining what kind of guide you might need, first of all, to look at who you're guiding. If you're creating a tool to guide yourself, something that might guide you through an exploratory test, for example, you might do something quite different from what you would do if you're creating a test charter for someone else, or if you're creating a test strategy that's then going to guide all of the rest of the testing, or a plan. You want to look at the skill level of the person being guided, and of course you want to look at who that person is on the project. If it's a customer or a business user, you might write something quite different, or you might do a diagram quite differently, and so on. And of course it's going to be different if it's a peer or if it's a team member. Potentially, it might be the same. What kind of thing is it you're trying to create? Let me just go back here so as not to distract. What kind of thinking? Is it a strategy? Is it a plan? Are you capturing ideas which you're then going to translate into test designs? Or is it in fact a test design? So that along with who the person is and what their skill level is will help you decide what's the optimal level of detail. I said we also want to inform. Now I've used this somewhat amusing bumper sticker because what it's saying is, I'm writing this down because I know this, but you don't know it, and it's something I think you need to know. And really, that's why we create artifacts, because there are things that we know that other people need to know, but that they're not going to find out unless we put it in an artifact that we can then use as a guide to conversation, or that we can publish to them, depending on the circumstances again. Going back to that who question again. So who is it you're going to be talking to? Who is it who needs to see this communication, and why? Typically, we want to keep our stakeholders in the loop, and that includes other people on the project. It could include the programmers, it could include management, all kinds of people. Often, we want to put things out in order to say, have I got this right? Or did I miss something? Sometimes we want to say, we really need your help in determining what's the right thing to do here. We need your help in generating test ideas. We need your help in finalizing the scope, all kinds of things. Or we want to say, this is what we're thinking, this is where we're going, and here's how we're going to execute this. What do you think? Are you okay with this? So, lots of reasons why you want to inform stakeholders. There may also be people outside your project who need to know what you're doing. Sometimes that's a future project, although I caution you that let's not create records for the sake of creating records. We don't have to archive absolutely everything, but sometimes it's important to know for future projects on the same software to have an idea of what it was that you did. Sometimes they may need details as well. If you're working in a larger organization or you're working on a larger project, particularly say a large program where a lot of systems are being integrated, you may well need to communicate to them what you're doing, and you'll need to find out what they're doing. And that may need an artifact for that kind of communication. You may also need to communicate with other organizations, your vendor or your customer. Sorry about the delay here. I'm just going to wait for the slide to catch up. Okay, it's taking its time. Okay, so I'm going to go to the final piece, which is demonstrating due diligence. Now, you'll see from the photograph, due diligence is about care. It's about exercising your duty to take care. It's a quasi-legal term. I'm going to say quasi-legal because I don't think that due diligence typically has a precise legal definition. but it's typically used in circumstances, in projects, or in business circumstances where there are high risks. I first encountered it in a corporate acquisition. When I was manager of QA, that was process QA, not testing, for a company, I was asked to go and evaluate the development processes of a company that we were planning to buy. And so that was part of our company's due diligence. We were finding out everything we needed to know about that company in order to make a good decision about whether to buy them and whether to spend our shareholders' money on buying them. You get the same sort of situation, the same kind of need, the same kind of duty, in fact, with capital investments. If you're a venture capital, there are a bunch of things that you are, ritualized things, in fact, that you are going to do to assure yourself that this is a good investment. There's a very strong need for due diligence in health and safety. And in any case where people could be injured, an employer has a duty to exercise due diligence in providing a safe working environment. Again, where I first encountered the term in software projects was in Y2K projects, where I was working for an energy utility, where we needed to exercise due diligence in evaluating the need to modify our systems. And in fact, for the systems that we didn't need to modify. So in assuring that we were looking at the right things and changing the right things. Okay. So I'll just look at a couple of definitions quickly. It's a little slow. So, the care that a reasonable person exercises to avoid harm to other persons or their property. I took that from the Merriam-Webster Online Dictionary, and I think it's a good definition for us to use in software. Let's take another one, which is taken from a health and safety example. This is the level of judgment, care, prudence, determination, and activity that a person would reasonably be expected to do under particular circumstances. Now, this one I took from, as I said, from a health and safety example. This is from the Canadian Centre for Occupational Health and Safety. And you'll see that these definitions are quite similar. And the one thing that they have in common that's very important is the term reasonable and reasonably. If you ever find yourself in court and you're expected to demonstrate due diligence in your testing, or someone is expected to demonstrate due diligence in how they executed a project, the court is not looking for perfection. The court is looking for reasonableness, the care that a reasonable person would take. So for us, I think that what that means is that we need to show clearly that we tested according to our best professional judgment, that we thought about risks, identified risks, assessed them, and then figured out how we were going to address them, whether that was management, mitigation, taking the risk, whatever. And that we had the appropriate skills and we applied them properly. I said show clearly, and I think that's really important, because the thing about due diligence is typically that you want to keep a record of having exercised it in a circumstance of potentially high risk. So if you're testing a system where there are high risks for your company or potentially high risks for the public, it may very well be in your company's interests that you keep a record of what you did. That has to show clearly what you did, but I would like to be straightforward here that does not necessarily mean a standardized set of formal documents. It means a clear record. If you did exploratory testing, it means keeping your session logs, for example. So again, you want to look at what it is that you really need to do and not do more. And not allow yourself into being stampeded into doing more, because quite often people will get, management in particular, or project managers will get a little anxious about the need for due diligence, and they'll overdo it, or want you to overdo it. So essentially, what I'm saying here is that we really need to make the artifacts serve the work, and that is good testing. that provides good information to our stakeholders. We don't want to make the work serve the artifacts. I'll just close with a photograph if it ever comes up here. My concern is to have the living, breathing test and not the model. Okay, I think we're done and we can go to the questions.
For a great presentation. Hopefully people didn't experience too many delays there with the slides. We will now take questions, and if anybody has a question, please type it into the comment box on your control panel and I will ask it to Fiona. Cheers. Okay, Fiona, the first question here, who will decide what would be the necessary and sufficient test documentation?
Well, that very much depends on the context. In most cases, you're going to have to get agreement. You're not the project manager, you're not running the project. You're going to need to get the project manager at the very least to agree. In some organizations, you may also have to get more senior management, line management to agree as well. But typically, I would say you should at least propose what it is that you want to do. So to that extent, you decide what it is you want to do, and then you may very well have to convince other people, depending on the circumstances.
Okay, second question coming through here, Fiona. Very interesting talk. Will the slides be available online anywhere? Well, I can answer that question. They will be made available on the EuroSTAR website. Third question coming through. This one is for you, Fiona. How we will maintain the traceability and coverage by creating a short documentation?
Well, again, I think what you want to do is examine whether you really need to have traceability. Going back to very formal processes, we were encouraged to do things like coverage matrices, and those still may be necessary depending on your circumstances. They may not be also. So I think I can't speak for your own context, but I think it's worth asking the question, how important is it that we demonstrate coverage? For yourself, you may very well want to do that, but remember that coverage matrices are typically requirements traceability. There's nothing wrong with showing that you've tested to requirements, but quite often people do that with spreadsheets, and that's a relatively easy way to do it. If you're in a contractual situation, you will almost certainly have to show that you have tested each requirement. But I hope no one thinks that that's full coverage testing anyway, or even recognizing that we can't ever have full coverage, or even that it's adequate coverage, because you're going to need to test more than the requirements.
Okay, thanks, Fiona. Another question coming through here. What are the necessary test documents in Agile testing from a Q&A point of view? Is there any sample document like matrices?
I can't tell you what the standard would be. There are lots of people's blogs out there talking about the kinds of things that they do, and I encourage you to go and have a look at what they do. I don't have particular samples from Agile projects because I don't typically work in Agile projects. I work in big projects that so far, unfortunately, have not been Agile. But certainly, I know that there are people who work in Agile projects who, for example, use mind maps for their test cases or for plans. There are lots of people who use diagrams, and there is a lot of material available. I'm going to pull some of it together for I'll just do a shameless plug here. I'm going to pull a number of examples together for my tutorial at EuroSTAR. This webinar kind of complements that tutorial where we're going to look at the top right sizing test documentation, we're going to look at samples, and do some exercises around choosing what might be appropriate in a given context.
Okay, the shameless plug is very welcome, by the way. Another question coming through. Hello, thank you for the presentation. I have only one question, which arguments should we use in small companies to convince management that having any documentation is important?
That's a good question, because usually we get the other one, the opposite one. Tell them what you need to do the job. They hired you for your expertise, I hope. And I would point out to them that there are some things that it's simply not possible for you to do, or not possible for you to do as effectively and efficiently without the artifacts that will help you. And perhaps the best argument to use with most management is money. In the opposite case where you feel you're being asked to do too much documentation, sometimes it's an effective argument to say, you know how much this costs. You're worried about the cost of testing. You're asking us to do stuff that's really expensive, that isn't adding value. And in your case, perhaps the opposite argument is, this is slowing us down, not having some of the artifacts that we need to have, and it's therefore costing more. Or we may miss things that we wouldn't otherwise have missed if we'd had the right artifacts. And those bugs perhaps that we miss, or areas of coverage that we miss that we really should have done, will also cost money when this thing goes live. I hope that's a reasonably helpful argument.
Yeah, I think the next question kind of feeds into that as well, Fiona. Do you have a good reference that we can use to try and convince our management that you can't get testers off the street?
Story. Experience. I understand that that's a really important consideration. Your management. No, I don't know of any good reference, except that there is, of course, there's a body of testing literature out there. Certainly the context-driven school of testing, James Bach and Kem Kainer and other people have written a lot about the need for testing skill. And I encourage you to go and have a look at their websites. And the websites of people like Michael Bolton. Lots of people have written about the need for skilled testers and how skilled testers will give you much better testing. And I mean, my experience is that it's also going to save you money having skilled testers, because they're going to find bugs, they're going to find them more quickly. Working with people off the street is going to get you rote testing that isn't real testing. But I can't point to a specific reference at the moment, but I know there is a lot out there. And if you write to me, or we'll put it on the blog, I'll put some links in to some websites where you'll find some useful stuff.
Okay, there's plenty of questions still rolling in here, Fiona. The next one, how important are templates as reminders for the test manager which areas he should think about, even if some sections in the template might not be useful in the current project?
That's up to you. I think that sometimes a template is helpful. Except that in my experience, I always end up changing it, no matter what I do. So sure, it doesn't hurt to have a template. What hurts, I think, is when you're forced to fill out sections that you don't need. A template, checklist, anything like that, as a guide to what to think about. All of those are good things. The danger arises when you're constrained to do things that you don't need to do. So, for example, I've seen test strategy templates where people are expected to say all over again, unit testing is this, integration testing is this, and they put in a whole lot of definitions that nobody needs to read, or they have to copy and paste in defect management strategies or defect management processes that are standard. So why not just reference them? So I'm not opposed to templates. I think they're useful, as I said, as a checklist, and as you said, as a way to remind you. But don't allow yourself to be constrained by a template. And there may be things, by the way, that you need to think about that are not in the template.
Okay, have you good advice to create a lean and useful test report, and do you have any specific experience of this?
I've used all kinds of things. I've used something I call a survey report, which you can find on my website, or at least you can find an article about it on my website. I've used dashboards. James Bach has a thing, a low-tech dashboard thing that he uses. Michael Bolton has amplified this somewhat on his website. Generally, I find that that's not quite enough, and so I do use something I call a survey report, which is somewhere in between the kind of detail that management sometimes thinks they want but don't actually read, and a higher level summary. You want something that maps to the process that you're using.
Okay, the next point is more of a statement than a question, but maybe you can answer it anyway, Fiona. Regarding the sign-off of these documents, sometimes they are signed off very late in the project once we are executing tests. So if the documents do change, they impact testing and become a small burden.
Yeah, that's a problem, particularly in larger organizations where it's very hard to get people to agree. I guess there are a number of things and points that may help to address this, and one of them is to keep your documents as light as possible, or keep your artifacts as light as possible, because the lighter they are, the more flexible they can be. So if you get, for instance, into a situation where you're having to write very detailed scripts and you're expecting people to sign those off, there are a couple of points about that. One is that it takes a long time for people to read that stuff, if they can even do it, and to get back to you. It's a big burden for them, so they keep putting it off. It may not be their priority. And then, if there are changes, you have to make a lot of changes in a lot of detail. So I think that it's important to understand what level of detail is really optimal here, and what level of detail will give us the flexibility to make changes when we find out more. Remember, I said at the beginning that I think testing is a process of discovery. Well, that's partly about the testing itself. It's partly about information that emerges as we go through a project. We learn more about a system, we learn more about our customers' needs, more about our stakeholders' needs, and we need to create artifacts that allow us to make changes quickly and incorporate those changes. So I think that the lighter you can keep your documentation, the easier it's going to be for you to do that.
Another question coming through here, Fiona. It seems that the ROI for documentation needs to be a consideration. Do you have recommendations for such calculations and communicating them?
I don't have standard calculations, but in a given situation, I would say, again, it's going to depend on the circumstance you're in. If you're in a circumstance where you're being asked to do too much documentation, you might want to have a conversation with your management, actually taking some of the documents that you're expected to create and pointing out the low value of some of the sections in those documents, or pointing out how you could do some piece that's absolutely essential in a way that's more effective for you and easier for people to understand, if indeed that's the case. In a circumstance where you're not being allowed to create documentation, or there is strong pressure not to create artifacts, well, what do? You have to take notes, presumably, of some kind. And again, I would all you can do, I think, is perhaps point to historical record of what went wrong that you missed because you didn't have an artifact to guide you. I realize that's not a very good answer, but I don't know what else you can do. again, I don't think there's much in the way of documentation on the ROI for artifacts, but I think you have to look at your own situation and see what you can prove there. I know I'm asking you to do a lot of thinking, but that's what we do as testers. We think, and often, unfortunately, we also have to advocate for what it is that we need to do and how we need to do it.
The next question is a two-part question, Fiona. How do you think we should react to formal standards, and how do we stop senior management and lawyers insisting on adherence because they assume it's best practice and therefore write them into the contract demanding the full set of documentation?
I think the only thing you can do is to address each piece and to ask a lot of questions. Like, how important is this particular standard? I do understand the dilemma, and I've been caught in it as well, where management believes that the safest thing to do is to document everything. But it's not cost effective, and it's not in their interest. Now, in the long run, I did say that sometimes there are overriding considerations. In the long run, it's not your decision, right? It is the decision of your management, and if they decide that you need to create huge documents that may or may not be necessary, then you're stuck. In which case you may want to move to an organization that is a little bit more flexible. This is a serious dilemma. What you might want to do is suggest to your management that you do a pilot project where you do a much lighter form of documentation and use alternative artifacts and do some kind of cost comparison. That's one suggestion, but I think once the lawyers are involved, you're often stuck. The problem here is you don't necessarily need to demonstrate due diligence in every circumstance. And of course, it's we all do what we're paid to do, right? And if you're a lawyer, you're paid to cover risk and find all the legal reasons, unfortunately, for you to be doing what it is that you do. Just as if you're a security person, it's up to you to find the most secure way to do things, which may or may not always be the most effective way to do things. So, unfortunately, as I said, you may be stuck.
Okay, I don't know if we're going to get to all the questions in the last few minutes, but we'll keep going while we have time. In the case of audit requirements, some of the testing process documentation are mandated formal requirements, starting with the test plan onto test preparation, execution, sign-off, completion. How do we deal with such circumstances?
I would do what I just suggested, which is if you don't think that that's the most effective way for you to do things, and you may think that it is. It may be in your circumstance, but if you don't think it is, propose an alternative and suggest a pilot project, and look at things like cost and return on investment. It's often these mandated rigid processes are very costly, and they don't necessarily give the best return. You're often producing things that are of very little value. But I think that unless we start proposing alternatives and unless we start actively producing alternatives, and pilot projects are often a good way to do this, then it's really hard to make the case.
This question is in relation to artifacts and their use. The flexibility in the artifacts produced depends on the project you were working on.
Sure. But that's the point, I think, that everything depends really on the project you're working on. If you're in a project where requirements change frequently, then you need to find a way to accommodate that in whatever artifacts you produce, in your testing generally, but also in the artifacts you produce. You need to be able to respond to changes in requirements. One of the very frequent complaints I hear from testers is God, the requirements are always changing. We don't have frozen requirements. Well, that's the project context you're in. And you need to learn to deal with that. You're not going to persuade people not to make changes. So it really is a question of finding what is going to work for you in a given context and being able to respond to those changes without having to do a whole lot of documentation that is not necessarily helping you test better.
Are there any thinking tools you could recommend which are perhaps not too well known?
Can't think of any offhand. Certainly I find mind maps really useful. I use mind maps for a lot of tasks, including when I sit down to write an article. I often do a mind map. Just get all my ideas out on the table. Diagrams. I use diagrams, of course, all the time as well. So no, I can't think of any sort of non-standard ones. I know there are some alternatives, and I tried one or two that I didn't find very useful for me. But when you're thinking about thinking tools, of course, you want something that's going to work for you. If you're collaborating and you're bringing together the thoughts of a lot of people, then you need a tool that works for collaboration. And mind map's pretty good for that, as is a diagram. But mind maps don't work for everyone. Some people find the however, we think that mind maps are not hierarchical. They are to some extent, and some people are not comfortable with that when they're creating relationships. There are different mind mapping tools, some of which allow you to get away from that hierarchical piece and, for example, create floating nodes where you're just capturing ideas and later you figure out how to fit them in. But there's nothing quite like sitting down at a whiteboard with people and developing either a diagram together, or in fact, if you are developing a mind map, doing it with something like sticky notes and drawn arrows so that you can move things around very, very readily. But if you have some suggestions, if anyone has suggestions for some other thinking tools, that would be great. And I'm sure we'd all like to see them, and I'll put them in a blog post on the EuroSTAR website.
Okay, while we're on the subject of mind maps, there are just two more questions relating to mind maps, so we'll go through these two questions and then wrap it up. The first of those is, could we use the same kind of mind map for different types of projects? All projects, even?
Well, I don't know, because I don't know what your projects are. Potentially, yes. But it's the same problem as it is with a template. Don't try to find a best practice. You may well find good practices for you and for your projects, but I think it's a mistake to assume that anything's going to be a best practice, even in a given context.
And Fiona, how do you track results of the test case execution in the mind maps?
I would have to ask the people who do mind maps for test cases. I can think of various ways you could do that. You could do it with nodes and so on, but that's probably not the most effective way of capturing what you've done. You might do it in a table. I don't know. I'm sorry, I can't answer that question. It may be that because if you're doing exploratory testing and you're using a mind map to guide that exploratory testing, then you're going to be creating a session log anyway and logging what it is that you do. So that's one way. If you're doing a more traditional kind of testing that is driven from test cases, then a mind map may not work as well for you for your test cases. But I encourage you to use test cases rather than very detailed scripts. So I'm sorry, I can't answer that question. But if anyone has a suggestion, if anyone on the call has a suggestion, please let me know or let us know, and we'll add that to the blog as well. And I'll try and find out the answer from the people who use them.
Okay, thanks Fiona. We'll have to leave it there because we've run out of time. Thanks again for a great presentation and to everyone who attended as well. As we mentioned earlier on, all questions and answers will be available on the EuroSTAR blog in the coming days. Please visit the site for more software testing content, including webinars and ebook archives. This webinar is now over. Have a great day.